Ivan Shishkin, The Eternal Forest. Part 1, The Roots of the Forest. The Whispering Studio. There is a story whispered among art students in St. Petersburg, that late at night if you pass the old academy building, you can hear the sound of wind through pine needles, though not a single tree stands nearby. They say it is the echo of Ivan Shishkin's studio, the place where forests once came alive on canvas. Visitors swore that stepping into his workspace was like stepping into the heart of a Russian woodland. There were pine cones scattered across the tables, dried moss pinned to boards, branches propped against walls. And in the silence as Shishkin worked, it seemed the air itself filled with the scent of resin and bark. It was as if he carried the forest inside him. Or perhaps, it carried him. But how did a boy born in a remote town on the Volga grow into the Tsar of the forest, the man whose brush gave trees the dignity of kings and the eternity of gods? The story begins not with greatness, but with hunger, solitude, and an almost supernatural obsession with nature. A boy of Yelabuga. Ivan Ivanovich Shishkin was born in 1832 in Yelabuga, a small town far from the centers of culture and art. Life was hard, the winters cruel, and survival demanded toughness. But surrounding the boy was something far more powerful than poverty: the endless Russian landscape. Rolling meadows, birch groves, dark rivers slipping under mist, and above all, the forest. For most children, woods were a place of fear, mystery, or play. For young Ivan they were teachers. He wandered for hours, sketching trees in crude lines, tracing the veins of leaves with a stick in the dirt. Every trunk seemed to him a monument, every fallen branch a story. His father, a merchant of modest means, noticed the boy's strange obsession. Instead of discouraging him, he offered paper and pencils. Soon Ivan was filling page after page with studies of bark, twigs, grass, insects, things other boys never noticed. The forest was not background to him. It was the very stage of life. The awakening of an eye. By his teenage years, Ivan's talent was undeniable. Villagers began to whisper of the boy who could capture a birch so real you might mistake it for the one outside. But for Ivan, realism was not enough. He wanted truth, not the surface of trees but their spirit. When he announced he wished to study art formally, his family hesitated. A painter's life was uncertain, risky. But Ivan was immovable like the very oaks he adored. And so, with a few rubles in his pocket and a portfolio of sketches under his arm, he set out for Moscow. Moscow, then St. Petersburg. Moscow was overwhelming, a place of noise and grandeur. Ivan felt both lost and hungry to prove himself. He enrolled briefly in the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture and Architecture, but soon realized that if he wanted to stand among giants, he needed the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg, the cold, glittering capital. A city of canals, palaces, and ambition. Here, under the stern gaze of academic masters, Ivan Shishkin faced his greatest trial. Professors admired his draftsmanship but mocked his obsession with landscapes. "History painting, my boy," they would say. "That is where immortality lies, not in weeds and pine needles." But Ivan refused to bend. While others copied Greek statues and biblical scenes, he slipped away to the countryside, sketching fields and forests in aching detail. Fellow students laughed at his endless trees. Yet his professors could not deny the precision of his hand, the power of his vision. The obsession deepens. Imagine Shishkin's tiny student room, a wooden desk littered with acorns, bark samples, half-dried grasses pressed between books. His sketchbooks overflowing with studies, hundreds of them, each pine cone, each blade of grass rendered with surgical care. He was not merely painting. He was studying like a scientist of the natural world. He believed the Russian forest held secrets, a language written in branches and roots. And if he could capture it, perhaps he could reveal something eternal about the Russian soul itself. Night after night, by candlelight, he worked until his fingers cramped and his eyes blurred. Students teased him, calling him the botanist with a brush. But Ivan felt no shame. He was laying roots for something far greater than they could imagine. The first glimpse of glory. By 1857, after years of labor, Shishkin graduated with the Academy's gold medal. His prize, the chance to travel abroad to study in Europe. For a boy from Yelabuga, it was a miracle. Suddenly he was walking the galleries of Munich, Zurich, Geneva, seeing the Alps rise like frozen gods, sketching them with feverish energy. Yet even among Europe's majestic mountains, Shishkin longed for home. To him, no scenery, no peak, no lake could rival the solemn dignity of Russian woods. Return of the forest. When he returned to Russia, his art erupted with new strength. Now, with the skill of Europe and the soul of Russia, He began to create canvases that silenced even his critics. Forests stretched endlessly, their shadows thick, their trunks monumental. Every pine stood not as a backdrop, but as an individual presence, ancient, wise, enduring. Viewers were stunned. These were not decorative landscapes. These were living worlds. The whispers began. He is the master of the Russian forest. They could not yet know he would become its Tsar. Part 2, The Struggle and the First Triumphs. A rising name. By the early 1860s, Shishkin's name was no longer a secret. The Academy, once doubtful of his obsession, now displayed his canvases with pride. Visitors to exhibitions found themselves pausing, hypnotized. His paintings did not merely depict trees, they breathed. Each trunk cast a shadow that seemed to reach into the gallery itself. One critic wrote, "Other painters give us views. Shishkin gives us the forest itself. You do not look at his works, you enter them." Yet with fame came pressure. In an age where art was judged by grandeur, narrative, and history, Shishkin's devotion to raw nature remained controversial. Was he a true master or merely a craftsman of detail? Ivan knew he had more to prove. The Circle of the Wanderers. Around this time, Shishkin connected with a group that would define Russian art, the Peredvishniki, the Wanderers. This brotherhood of artists rejected academic rules and sought to bring art to the people, traveling with exhibitions across Russia. Among them were Ilya Repin, Ivan Kramskoy, and later Isaac Levitan. Together they believed that Russian art must not mimic Europe but reflect Russia itself, its land, its peasants, its soul. For Shishkin the choice was clear. Where others painted human struggles, he would paint the land those struggles grew from. To him, the Russian forest was not backdrop but destiny, the silent witness to centuries. A marriage amid pines. In 1868, Ivan married the daughter of fellow artist Ivan Krulov. Friends described the union as joyful, filled with laughter and children's voices. Shishkin, who had always seemed married to his trees, now discovered family warmth. He painted with renewed vigor, filling canvases with summer sunlight and tranquil fields. His works radiated a sense of abundance, as if life itself had opened wide before him. But happiness in Shishkin's life never lasted long. The first blow. In 1874, tragedy struck. His wife, young and full of promise, died suddenly. The shock shattered Ivan. Within a few years he also lost two of his beloved children. The grief was unbearable. Friends recalled how the once hearty, booming Shishkin grew withdrawn, silent, and stern. He poured his sorrow into work, retreating to his studio as if to hide from the world. It was then that his canvases began to change. The forest grew darker, the pines taller and lonelier, the skies vast and melancholy. His brush no longer celebrated life, it mourned it. A visitor once wrote, "Standing before his paintings, one feels not joy but awe. These are forests older than men, stronger than grief. They will outlive us all." A forest cathedral. His most celebrated work of the period, Morning in a Pine Forest, 1878, captures this duality. Four bear cubs tumble among sunlit trees, playful and innocent. Yet behind them, the forest rises like a cathedral, solemn, eternal, indifferent. The contrast is haunting. Life is brief, joy fleeting, but the forest endures. Audiences adored the painting, and it became one of the most famous images in Russian art. To this day, it hangs as both a national treasure and a window into Shishkin's soul. The studio as a wilderness. By the 1880s, visitors described Shishkin's studio as something between a laboratory and a wilderness. The floor was littered with pine branches, the shelves stacked with stones, bark, dried plants. His assistants joked that one could find half of Russia's botany in his workshop. He would spend hours dissecting the structure of a single leaf, then render it in painstaking detail. But when he stepped back, his canvases were not mere studies, they were vast, breathing landscapes, so immersive that people swore they could hear wind among the trees. It was as though he believed that by understanding every needle of every pine, he might unlock the secret language of the forest itself. Conflict and criticism. Despite his growing fame, not all were convinced. Some critics accused Shishkin of lacking imagination. "He is a draftsman, not a poet," they scoffed. "His trees are too real, too literal. Where is the mystery, the soul?" These words wounded him. He argued bitterly with colleagues who favored more romantic or impressionistic styles. For Ivan, truth lay in precision, in the unembellished majesty of nature. To distort the forest was to betray it. This conflict between realism and poetry became the central tension of his career, and the very force that drove him deeper into obsession. Triumph despite loss. Through hardship and loneliness, his reputation only grew. His paintings were purchased by collectors, honored at exhibitions, displayed in state galleries. Peasants, aristocrats, and even Tsars stood before his canvases and felt the hush of pines, the vastness of Russia's wilderness. But Ivan himself remained restless, haunted by personal grief and critical doubt. Success could not erase the silence in his home, the absence of voices he had once loved. And so he painted, endlessly, relentlessly, as if each canvas were a monument not just to nature, but to what he had lost. The forest becomes eternal. By the late 1880s, Shishkin was no longer merely a painter of trees. He was the voice of Russia's wilderness. His works carried a mythic weight, as if he had tapped into something beyond art, something sacred. One writer declared, "Shishkin's forests are not landscapes. They are Russia itself, immense, indestructible, eternal." But beneath this triumph lay a man weary, scarred, and increasingly solitary. And as he entered the final phase of his life, his brush would capture not only the glory of forests, but the shadows gathering at their edges. Part 3, The Tsar of the Forest. Crowned by the Pines. By the 1890s, Ivan Shishkin was no longer just a respected painter, he was a legend. The newspapers began calling him the Tsar of the Forest. His canvases were displayed like icons, commanding reverence not only in Russia but across Europe. He was awarded medals, appointed professor at the Imperial Academy, and honored as the guardian of Russia's most sacred symbol, the forest itself. But though crowds applauded, Shishkin remained stoic. He often muttered that fame meant nothing if one could not remain true to nature. A canvas that breathed Russia. In 1878 he had created Morning in a Pine Forest, but the following decade brought works that seemed to define the Russian soul itself. One of his most celebrated was Rye, 1878, an endless golden field under a sky of blue and white, with solitary pines rising like sentinels. The painting became instantly iconic. Viewers swore they could feel the scent of grain, the heat of summer air, the eternity of Russian land. Farmers claimed it was the truest painting ever made, while intellectuals read it as an allegory of strength and endurance. Rye is not a field, one critic wrote, it is Russia itself, stretching to infinity. In the Wild North. Another masterpiece, In the Wild North, 1891, revealed Shishkin's darker side. Here the trees rise like frozen giants in a barren northern landscape. The silence is so vast it becomes oppressive, almost frightening. It is nature stripped of comfort, raw, eternal, merciless. Standing before it, one felt both awe and dread. It was as if Shishkin had painted the very bones of the earth, cold and unyielding. A master among giants. By now, Shishkin shared the stage with Russia's greatest artists, Repin, Kramskoy, Levitan. They admired his dedication but also feared his authority. He could be blunt, dismissive, uncompromising. In the academy, students whispered that having Shishkin as a teacher was both a blessing and a curse. His standards were merciless. He demanded hours of sketching bark, branches, leaves until fingers cramped. "If you do not know every leaf," he would thunder, "you do not know the forest." And yet, those who endured emerged transformed. Many would later credit him as the father of Russian landscape painting, the man behind the pines. Despite his fame, Shishkin's private life was barren. After the death of his wife and children, he never truly recovered. He lived alone, his only companions the canvases towering in his studio. Visitors described him as a bear of a man, broad-shouldered, with a booming voice, but behind his eyes lay sorrow. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was brief, almost apologetic. Some evenings, colleagues found him wandering the forests outside Moscow, sketchbook in hand, as if he belonged more among the pines than among men. A second family. For a time, Ivan found solace in his students. Young artists gathered around him, eager to inherit his knowledge. He guided them not only in technique but in reverence for nature. "Do not imitate me," he told them, "imitate the forest. I am only its servant." Yet even here loneliness clung to him. When others celebrated, he withdrew. When others painted people, he returned again and again to his endless trees. It was as though he could not forgive the world for taking his loved ones, and so he chose to love only what could not betray him, the eternal forest. Recognition and criticism. Though adored by the people, Shishkin's reputation among critics remained divided. Some called him the truest Russian painter, the man who captured the nation's soul. Others sneered that he was a photographer with a brush, too literal, too cold, lacking the poetry of Levitan or the emotion of Repin. But Shishkin refused to bend. "They will die," he once said of his critics, But the forest will not. And neither will my work. The burden of immortality. As the century drew to a close, Shishkin's health began to fail. He was plagued by exhaustion, yet he painted with the same intensity as in youth. His final years became a race against time, as though he sensed the forest calling him home. His last great canvases grew more solemn, more immense, as if he were no longer painting for men but for eternity itself. One visitor recalled him staring for hours at a half-finished work, whispering, "It must not be just a forest. It must be the forest. The Tsar alone." By the mid-1890s, Ivan was hailed as the patriarch of Russian landscape, but he lived like a hermit. Fame, wealth, and titles could not heal the emptiness inside him. Yet even in solitude he had triumphed. His art had transcended criticism, fashion, and time. He had become the forest's eternal witness, its chosen voice. And still the story was not over. For the Tsar of the forest would meet his end not in grandeur, but in quiet tragedy, alone with brush in hand, surrounded by the silence he had worshipped all his life. Part 4, The Last Brushstroke. The Weight of Years. By the final years of the 1890s, Shishkin was an old man though still a giant. The decades of tireless work had left his body weary. His thick hands, once unshakable, trembled when he held the brush. His vision dimmed, his steps slowed. And yet he did not stop. If anything, his obsession grew fiercer. The less time he had, the more desperately he painted. "I will die with the brush in my hand," he told his students. "That is how it should be." The studio as a tomb. His studio in St. Petersburg had become a kingdom of shadows. Massive unfinished canvases leaned against the walls. Endless birch groves, pine forests drowning in snow, summer fields rippling like golden oceans. The smell of turpentine and pine resin lingered in the air. It was not simply a room, it was a forest in captivity. Standing inside, one felt as though the trees themselves were pressing in, whispering, alive. Late at night, neighbors swore they saw the glow of his lamps flickering long after midnight, as though the painter were locked in battle with eternity itself. The silent rivalry. By this time, Isaac Levitan had risen to fame with his poetic, emotional landscapes. Critics often compared the two, Levitan the lyricist, Shishkin the realist. Some claimed Levitan painted the soul of nature, while Shishkin painted only its body. When asked, Shishkin grumbled, "Levitan paints moods. I paint truth." But secretly he admired Levitan's depth, and feared that the younger painter's fame would eclipse his own. The rivalry burned in silence, never fully spoken. The final winter. In early 1898, Shishkin began work on a new painting, a vast forest clearing, birches glowing in the pale light of winter. It was to be one of his greatest works, a culmination of all he had learned, a farewell to the world. Day after day he labored, coughing, gasping but refusing to rest. He worked in heavy coats, his breath clouding the freezing studio, his hands raw from cold. One evening a student begged him to stop. Shishkin only growled, "The forest does not rest. Why should I?" The last morning. On the 20th of March 1898, Shishkin rose early and went into his studio as always. He was 66 years old. He set his canvas on the easel. He mixed his paints. He lifted the brush. Sometime that morning his heart failed. When his students found him, he was slumped in his chair before the half-finished forest. The brush was still clutched in his hand, a stroke of white frozen mid-motion. The room was silent, except for the distant creak of the canvases, like trees swaying in the wind. A forest eternal. News of his death swept through Russia like a storm. Crowds gathered at his funeral. Farmers, peasants, artists, aristocrats, all came to honor the man who had given them their forest in eternal form. They called him the voice of Russia's nature, the Tsar of the forest, the man who gave trees a soul. Yet those who knew him best whispered that he had died as he lived. Alone, stubborn, devoted only to the forest. The immortal pines. And so, Ivan Shishkin became immortal. Today his canvases still breathe. Walk into a gallery, stand before morning in a pine forest, and you will hear the cubs playing, smell the resin, feel the eternal silence of the woods. Stand before Rye, and you will sense the heartbeat of Russia stretching into infinity. It is said that in the stillness of his works, one can hear his voice, the whisper of a man who loved nothing more than the endless, indifferent, eternal forest. The whispering legacy. There is a legend among his students. They claimed that sometimes late at night in his old studio, one could hear the faint scratching of a brush. That even in death, Shishkin never truly left his forest. That he still paints, somewhere beyond the horizon, where the pines rise forever and the fields stretch into eternity. Final words. Ivan Shishkin's life was not a life of glamour, scandal, or romance. It was a life of solitude, discipline, and devotion, an unbreakable covenant with the Russian land. His tragedy was loneliness. His triumph was immortality. And in the end, as his heart stopped before the unfinished forest, he gave the world not just paintings, but silence, eternity, and the eternal breath of the trees.